Okay, we're back. Dean Rachel Kyte, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. So we're going to talk about West Ham.
Yes.
We're both fans of the English Premier League. We're not going to talk about football or soccer.
Shame.
Shame. We're also not going to talk about what is wrong in sort of the world of countries meeting their commitments or how bad climate change is. I think we've done a fair bit of that today.
So we're not going to adore the problem.
No, we're going to move towards solutions, and I think you're just the right person to discuss climate finance with because of what you've done in your career and the roles you've had at the World Bank and elsewhere. So I guess just to level set, on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you think we're at in terms of the climate finance discussion, debate, reality this year?
Somewhere between 0 and 5. And I think if you'd asked me a few months ago, I would have said we were, in negative territory. I think what's important about this year is that we finally are beginning to have an adult conversation around the fact that countries can't grow green or build the resilience and adaptation that they need to the already extreme impacts of climate change if they are highly indebted. So we have to have a conversation about how the economic and financial system works and how the institutions that we've created nearly 80 years ago to sort of manage the international financial system when in crisis operate in a polycrisis. And so what I mean, I think there have been references today to the Bridgetown Initiative. There is a series of voices now coming from low-income and middle-income countries on the back of the economic dislocation of the pandemic, the fact that climate change wipes 5 to 25% of GDP growth off many, many countries every year already because of the effect of extreme weather. The fact that the global north left the global south high and dry during the vaccine emergency in the pandemic, and then fuel and food price inflation as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So there's this set of circumstances which see more and more countries in debt distress, and then we expect that they're going to engineer their pathway through their nationally determined contribution to a green and 1.5 world. It's not going to happen, and the finance hasn't been there. So
what you're describing, of course, is the polycrisis, which, for those of you who don't know, is a term that was popularized in the last year or so by Adam Tooze, who's an FP columnist, of course. But what you're saying, Rachel, is that this year it seems like there's a recognition of the polycrisis and the fact that, given high indebtedness around the world, we need to be having a different kind of conversation.
Yes, because up until now, there's been a climate finance conversation which is rich countries made a promise and you haven't delivered on it. So there's been a lot of toxicity about the fact that the finance that was promised in previous years in climate negotiations was never delivered. There's a conversation around the fact that development assistance, which should be separately accounted for, has not been delivered. And in fact, it's now in reverse because a lot of aid is going into supporting Ukraine. And then we've had this sort of conversation that the public sector's finances need to be used to leverage and crowd in private investment, and that actually private investment is going to solve most of these problems. Well, of course, private investment, and there's no shortage of money in the global economy, should be used to invest in the green infrastructure that we need in the future. It's not going to do that on its own. But there are also many things that have to be paid for with the public purse. And there are many things in many poor countries which will simply have to be subsidised. So I think that we're starting to see all of those conversations come together into a much more, I think, realistic conversation about how does the international system help countries get out of their debt distress and on a green pathway, and that's going to mean changes to institutions, changes to priorities, both in rich countries and in poor countries.
So that tees us up nicely. When you then, given everything you say, when we look at how to raise the money for whether it's loss and damage payments or other mitigation measures, what are the mechanisms or the new types of, whether it's blended finance or other phrases that I hear thrown around this town, what excites you? What's going to work?
Well, it's not. The first thing to do is to stop doing stupid things. And
it's easier said than done.
Yes, but we're now at the pointy end of the need for climate action. So, the prognosis for economic development and growth over the next decades, as published by the IMF just 2 weeks ago, was the most sluggish in 30 years. So we have to be clever about this now. What is not clever is subsidising fossil fuels harmfully to the extent that we are. Fossil fuel subsidies have doubled, more than doubled, since the beginning of the pandemic. And so that's extraordinary. And then we're seeing extraordinary profits from the listed companies in the fossil fuel sector as a result of the sort of race to energy security since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So there is a sort of, really crude sort of sloshing around of finance going into exactly what we don't need. So we can do two things. One, we stop the subsidies and we apply the subsidies where they need to be applied. Secondly, we adopt more industrial policy and incentives, as we see with the IRA. Third, you start to incentivise and reward leading green action in the here and now. So even within the oil and gas sector, you'll see the BPs and the Shells of this world, who would be considered broadly best in class. You see their share price really quite low down, and you see companies that are having a hard time expressing how they think they can align themselves with Paris with very, very high share prices. So there's something wrong in the system. And then, so that's, don't do the stupid things. What more could we do? We could take some of those windfall profits and apply them. I don't understand why we can't float a loss and damage fund of a few $100 billion when those profits are in the trillions. So there are lots of, I think, just, things that could be achieved, in the not too distant future. In addition then to the innovation that Andrew and DFC talked about in the last panel, where those kinds of innovations are proven, but they need to go to scale. And the question we now have is, to be able to do that kind of blue bond across the world will require the IMF to operate differently, will require the owners of the IMF to operate differently, will require mobilisation of the MDBs differently, it will require a green meagre 5 times the capacity that it has now. These are not impossible things to do, and they could be done this year and next year. Next year, it's 80 years of the Bretton Woods institutions. There is no reason why these institutions can't be vastly greened for their 80th birthday. And then there's the private sector, and here we have the problem again of this woke backlash against ESG. Be under no illusion about what this is about. This has got nothing to do with ESG. This has actually got nothing to do with sustainability. This is about power and control. And once you assume power and control one place, then you'll go to the next place. Or if you lose it in one place, you'll go to the next place. So the argument around whether or not you want to protect your financial system and whether you want to really build macro-prudential risk management into your financial system, it is about who has the money and who's going to keep the money and who's going to spend the money on what. Now, what that's doing is slowing down, I think, the response of the financial sector, in particular in this country, to the fact that there are bad assets and there are going to be stranded assets and there are good things to invest in. And so we have to align public policy with the behaviour and governance of banks and insurance companies and other actors within the financial sector. Again, not impossible to do. Europe is at one stage, the US is at another, China's at another. We're going to need to have that happen globally.
Again, I mean, easier said than done. When Senator Sheldon Whitehouse was here, he was pointing out the difficulties he's faced in Congress here. And, for everything you say about subsidies on the fossil fuel companies, I do wish the protesters who were here earlier were listening in or are listening into this. I guess the question...
But they were right.
Yeah, they were.
Right.
Yes.
Just to be really clear.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think they're making the right argument. But the question is how? Like, politically, how do you advance what you're describing?
So,
and you seem quite optimistic, but I think both the senators who've been on so far were not very optimistic.
No, I'm a hopeful pessimist. So... But my experience at the World Bank when it came to subsidy reform was that you very rarely were able to win that argument in the face of domestic, local and politics and vested interests if you went in and talked about it from a climate perspective. But when you talked about it in terms of people's ability to afford energy, people's ability to afford the basics that they need, and you went in from a sort of social safety net, a people-focused set of arguments, and worked very hard on the communication around that, then countries were able to wean themselves off these subsidies. So subsidising people so that they can afford clean energy is not harmful. What's harmful is putting the subsidy in the pocket of the middleman or in the oil and gas company and expecting them somehow to do something different than what they've done up to now. So it isn't impossible, and but it does mean changing the narrative. And so it means when you have Senator Merkley standing up here, sitting up here, pointing out that the Willow Project has completely undermined the ability of any American diplomat to work effectively at the G7 or at the G20, because, you know, do as we say, not do as we do, he should get a round of applause. He should be applauded, because that is exactly what is going on. The fact that the Japanese and the Americans and the UK and everybody else are arguing at the moment over grey hydrogen, green hydrogen, you know, can we do this, can we do that? There needs to be a clarity from the G7 of, like, we are in an emergency, we need urgent action, this is what we're going to do. We're not there yet, but then we have to put people in office who will continue to make that case. At the end of the day, the politics is not as good as the science.
It never is. We're almost out of time. Could it be? I hope it is. I hope it will be. What are you looking... What should we expect on the road ahead to COP28 this year?
A lot of noise around COP28, maybe some big financial sort of new institutions, new packages, new ideas coming from the UAE. Maybe if they're deployed properly, they could leverage the MDBs differently. New leadership at the World Bank, an opportunity for a green MEGA. And then not a lot, I think, of new pledges from countries. These are difficult economic times, but progress around the structure of voluntary carbon markets, lots of innovation, lots of proof that there is a different way of doing things. And then hopefully, June 2024, 80 years of the Bretton Woods institutions, we should go for green.
Last quick question. There are a lot of people in this room who care about all the issues we've been talking about today, and there are policymakers watching this on our live stream. If you had a word of advice for them to sort of not feel defeated by where things are at, and to get a sense of where to channel their energies this year, what would you say?
Don't get distracted by bright, shiny things. We have to put our hands under the hood, in the engine, and shift it around and make it work cleanly for the current crisis that we're in, and we're perfectly capable of doing it.
Dean Rachel Kyte, thank you for your time.
Thank you.